Maybe, I mean, you can say, oh, well, Al Gore was the Zell Miller or the Joe Lieberman of 1988, you know. Or you could say that, I mean, it's
well, I don't know if you noticed in your book, but you had an interesting tidbit when you're saying it was the first time, in 1956, that was the first time since 1844 with Zachary Taylor that the party who won the presidency also lost both houses. Well, that could be applied to now for Republicans who want to say, listen, even though we might get slaughtered in the Senate and the Representatives, we still might win with McCain, evidenced by the fact that Eisenhower won.
Sure, there's still historical facts, you know, that you know, you can draw on, that are the raw materials for the inferences we draw. But you know, a lot of the kind of analogies that you hear pundits make about previous presidential elections are at a pretty low level of analytical rigor, shall we say.
So you write a blog called The Big Con. Why are you a liberal?
Why am I a liberal? Because the liberals freed the slaves, because the liberals gave women the vote, because the liberals brought us out of the economic chaos of the Depression, because the liberals beat Hitler in World War II, because the liberals gave us the first mass middle class in the history of the world, because the liberals gave gays and lesbians some semblance of equal rights in America. I believe in freedom, I believe in dignity, I believe in equality, and that's the liberal tradition in America.
Well, why do you necessarily say that Lincoln was a liberal?
Well, certainly in the context of his time, he was. The conservatives were the people who wanted slavery to expand to the western states, like Stephen Douglas. And you know, if you read Lincoln, you know that he was reading the cutting edge thinkers of the day. You know, people like Mill, who's certainly one of the great liberal thinkers. And liberalism is about expanding the frontiers of justice. And one of the problems with reading conservative thought is, a friend of mine, a professor at Berkeley, Brad DeLong, said he has a really hard time finding social conservative thinkers to assign to his students because they're always doing things like, from previous generations, because they're always doing things like defending the natural inferiority of women or something like that. Things that we would never dream of. Edmund Burke actually looks like a liberal these days. He was for, he was for challenging the royal prerogatives.
I see. But then you have the conservatives who say, well, all of these historical characters were actually, they would modern day terms, they would actually be conservative. So I guess
conservatism. That's why I call it, one of the reasons I call conservatism the big con. I mean, conservatives these days are very good at basically washing themselves in the blood of the Lamb and declaring innocence from any consequence from any action that they had. Well, anything Nixon did has nothing to do with conservatism. Anything Reagan did, well, that was because he sold out to the liberals. But then when he does something liberal, like talks to Gorbachev and helps end the Cold War, well, that must have been conservative. So there's a lot of conservatives. Conservatism. There's a saying I wrote that's probably the most quoted line I ever wrote. Conservatism never fails; it has only failed. So conservatism and conservative thought becomes a synonym for good. There's no such thing as a bad conservative. It's just somebody who betrays conservatism. So conservatism becomes this kind of innocence machine. It becomes this way of washing one's hands of the consequences of, like people will say, oh, well, Bush isn't a conservative, but, well, his government is staffed from top to bottom with people who come from places like the Heritage Foundation, who come from AEI, who come from places like Regent University, who come from this conservative movement that was basically created through the 60s and 70s in order to kind of staff the government once we got a conservative president in there. So, to kind of suddenly say, well, whoops, he passed Medicare Part D, so he doesn't have anything to do with conservatism. That's that innocence. That's that will to innocence I'm talking about. Conservatism never fails, it has only failed.
And look, but you're saying liberals are willing to criticize their own more?
Oh yeah, I mean, so many of the liberals I write about in here were idiots.
Kennedy has the dirtiest tactics you could think of.
Not the dirtiest tactics you could think of.
They're pretty dirty.
He didn't break into the opposing parties.
No, but he violated plenty of agreements that he made and twisted this and twisted that, and his father bought off people. I mean, he certainly.
Yes, they were tough. They were tough operators. Yes, and I do write about basically how John F. Kennedy's dad, bought him his congressional seat and all the rest. But
couldn't you say the same thing about liberals? Like, they say that they, betrayed liberalism. It's not that liberalism ever failed us.
No, I think liberalism did fail us. I think the liberals had nothing to say about the rising crime rates in America. They just said, like you said, throw more money at the problem. I think liberals have worked through a lot of those historical errors. I mean, that's a big part of the New Democrat project of the Clintons in the 90s. Liberals could be astonishingly condescending about the legitimate grievances of ordinary middle-class Americans for everyday law and order. And
but you're accusing that modern-day Republicans won't criticize Reagan, but you think Obama would ever criticize JFK?
It's not really what presidential candidates do. I mean, they don't kind of.
No, but I'm saying you're arguing that conservatives are never willing to, say that Reagan, when he made a mistake, but you don't think also liberals can be the victim of the same thing?
Sure, they can do it, but that's kind of become all conservatism is these days. I read a lot of these books, like David Frum's book, What We Have to Do to Win, or whatever it was called.
But I'm sure David Brooks of the world is very. I mean, it's easy to make these generalizations, but I think there are many thoughtful conservatives too.
I didn't say there weren't thoughtful conservatives.
But I don't know. You seem to argue that conservatives are a lot less willing to admit the truth or look at.
Well, I mean, there's a colossal constituency within the conservative movement that wants to deny that mankind has caused climate change. Conservatives
and a lot of liberals might not admit that the New Deal didn't actually help us. I mean, they're all different. I mean,
the New Deal didn't actually help us.
I mean, unemployment rate in 1938 was higher than 1933.
Right. That's because FDR decided that he wanted to balance the budget. Basically, kind of had a political loss of will and decided he didn't want to pursue the early policies.
It's not that he enforced a lot of legislation that was anti-business and had less of an incentive to or monetary policy.
Anti-business. The National Recovery Administration was run by business. How could it be anti-business?
What's that bill that the 1937 that they passed that
Fair Labor Standards?
Yeah, with the unions, and I mean the FDR's followed that whole book. You completely dismiss the idea that maybe the New Deal actually didn't really lift people out of poverty. It was the war lift people out of poverty.
Well, history's complex. I mean, they both lifted people out of poverty, but I don't know that book, The New Deal Folly. What is it?
FDR's Folly.
What is it? Who's that?
No, that basically the New Deal exacerbated the problems instead of helping.
Well, the New Deal was this pragmatic attempt to deal with the problems as they came up. I mean, it wasn't this, ironclad doctrine. There were a lot of New Deals. There was the National Recovery Administration, which I mentioned, which was run by business, that the Supreme Court outlawed because they said it was basically a cartel. By the time World War II came along, the New Deal was basically a program of stimulating consumer spending and Keynesianism.
From the government side.
What's that?
For the government side, the demand side to the supply side.
And so yeah, I don't know the FDR's Folly book, but I mean, conservatives have an enormous stake in discrediting the New Deal. I do know M.D. Schleye's work on the New Deal, and I find it utterly unconvincing. She makes similar arguments with a very tendentious grasp of the shape of what actually happened in the 30s. Like, she'll talk about how unemployment increased in 1938. They called it the Roosevelt recession. Who mentioned that basically he pulled back from the very policies that were causing recovery.
How about the monetary argument that to cure it, they actually should have just lowered interest rates, and that was where the problem was from? That's the more familiar.
Yeah, now I'm kind of you're over my head now.
Okay. Rick Perlstein, thank you so much for coming on. And you're going to write a book about Reagan in the 80s, or what's the next project?
It's going to be from 1973 to 1980.
Well, I'm sure it'll be as good or better than this. Rick Perlstein, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for watching.